If your RTX 4070 is still in the box, maybe save that receipt. You might want to return it with these new AMD GPUs, right? Well, let's talk about it without really hyping it up. I know that's always the thing. AMD announces stuff that looks really good on paper, and the performance looks good, the pricing looks good, and then when it comes out, something always happens, right? Maybe with the drivers, like remember the 7900 XT, XTX, they had a bunch of little issues that made it not really the best experience if somebody was buying it. But I must say, AMD certainly is attacking Nvidia where it's like their weakest point and sort of like that $500 range. The GPUs we're talking about are the, recently announced, as in today, 7800 XT for $499 and the 7700 XT for $449. Interesting to note that the specs, like when you first look at them, it looks more like the 6800 really than the 6800 XT. That was always my opinion, that the product stack on both Nvidia and AMD side was really altered in such a way to make you think you're getting a better GPU from what the hardware is telling you. Case in point, 4070 Ti, remember that was a 4080 12 gigabyte, but Nvidia was not able to get away with that, so they had to downgrade it to the 4070 Ti. Same GPU, just a different name on the box. And now let's hear a word from our sponsor, VIP-CDKdeals.com, a Windows 10 Pro CD key. Add to cart, you put in code CC20. This will also work on Windows 11. You want to go into your settings in Windows, change and adjust your CD key, click activate, and now let's go back to the video. And it was always my opinion as well that the 7900 XT should have been the 7800 XT. In terms of the performance disparity between that and the 7900 XT, it just makes a lot more sense if we historically compare the 6900 XT to the 6800 XT. Those two were a lot more similar even. The 7900 XT is definitely a tier above the 7800 XT or the 7900 XT without the X. That's a lot of X's and T's. That's why it's easy to get confused. But the official 7800 XT, that's $499. Remember, a 6800 XT was $649. So we're seeing a pretty big price reduction based on the naming scheme of the GPU. But really, it's still a price reduction because even if this is more similar to a 6800, that one was $579. So $499 tells you that AMD's trying to be very, very competitive. That's the same thing when we heard the 7900 XTX at $999. It pretty much gets very far away from pricing of the 4080, which was $1199, but it can sometimes perform significantly better than a 4080. And then we get into those little items of interest like, DLSS, ray tracing, things that historically AMD has been a little bit weaker to respond with, but they also have something to kind of back up, at least with DLSS. FSR 3.0, that's supposed to be coming out probably with Starfield next month from everything that we can tell, as well as this new HyperRX technology, which is like a combination of many different things. A lot of it's going to be similar to what Nvidia does, but doesn't necessarily use the same, AI-focused hardware. So it's done a little bit differently with both FSR 3 as well as the HyperRX, but anything that gets you more frames and at least mitigates the issues with latency by like that Radeon anti-lag or even with the Nvidia Reflex are definitely things that are welcomed. And at least from experience, let's say if I'm playing at 1440p with a GPU that can struggle in some games, like a 4060, maybe a 4060 Ti, maybe something like a Ratchet and Clank or something like that with ray tracing on. If you don't put on any type of upscaling, you're going to get a bit of a choppy performance if you want to max it out. You're going to have to reduce a lot of settings. But if you do turn on DLSS 3, for example, even on quality, the experience is a lot smoother, so it definitely feels better. Hard to notice any lag in those type of games, really, but definitely feels better. So I kind of agree with upscaling technology. Obviously, it'd be better if game developers optimize their games from the get-go, and we have a nice scaling technology that just makes everything better. But I don't think it's a bad technology, and it's the way that the industry is going to go anyway. So I just hope that they can make it and perfect it until they're better and better. Now, the thing that we have to talk about here, what is going to compete with that 7800 XT? From AMD's own graphs, and we're going to have to take it with a pinch of salt, if you will, until we see actual reviews, in many games, it is beating the 4070. Stuff like Hogwarts and games like that. Definitely, of course, Call of Duty. It definitely seems to have an advantage over the 4070. And somewhere else, it clearly has an advantage is in 16 gigabytes of VRAM versus 12 gigabytes. I've been testing the 4060 Ti, both the 8 gigabyte as well as the 16 gigabyte version. And I must say, even though when the VRAM isn't an issue, they're like identical, when the VRAM is an issue, like if you're playing a game at 1440p and you're maxed out, a game that's going to eat up that VRAM, you can definitely get much higher frame rates on the 16 gigabyte version, much smoother gaming experience. So more VRAM is basically almost always better as long as the price is reasonable. And while I don't think a 4060 Ti is really that attractive of an option, especially not at $499. Remember, that's the price of the 7800 XT. 4070 is a level above the 4060 Ti at 12 gigabytes of VRAM, $599. So AMD's comparing against a $100 more expensive GPU. Of course, they also compare to the 4060 Ti. So if it can beat a 4070 for $100 less, and it has these upscaling technologies like FSR 3.0, we don't know how good it's going to be yet. It's a new technology. We know DLSS 3, especially, with the frame generation, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Like there's some games like Flight Simulator, even Cyberpunk. It definitely makes a big difference. Like it looks better, it's smoother. It makes you feel like you just upgraded your GPU and you don't really notice the latency, really, honestly. But if these things are going to be equally as good on the AMD side, like FSR 3 and this new Hyper RX, thing that some games are going to take advantage of, not everything, just like DLSS. FSR is going to be a little bit more inclusive, in the way that it uses the hardware. So that's going to be better news. DLSS 3 is really only tied down with frame generation, and 3.5 now with that ray reconstruction. That's going to be, something that you're going to be able to take the most advantage of on RTX, 4000 because of the tensor cores and everything like that, the optical sensors. But anyway, $499 versus a $599 4070, at least from AMD's number. Not every game beats it, by the way. They do mention some that maybe aren't nearly as good. Like if you look on the list of Dying Light 2, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the Spider-Man, Hitman 3. Some games, the 4070 certainly is better. And I'm sure with ray tracing, that's where you're going to see the biggest difference. But there are other games where it's pretty significant, like Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 2, and Cyberpunk, 23% better at the 1440p with max settings. So that's certainly actually pretty impressive. So there's definitely a lot of very interesting things going on here. It's not only with the pricing of the GPU. Honestly, when I see pricing for new AMD GPUs, they always tend to give you a good feeling about it, like the 7900 XTX. That was a pretty good feel. It's a $999 GPU. Don't get me wrong, it's expensive. But after seeing a $1,600 4090, a $1,200 4080, and then it had some performance that sometimes matched the 4090, like, okay, you feel pretty good about that. Then obviously, sometimes it doesn't live up to expectations because, drivers and some games, it doesn't work nearly as well as we thought. So you can expect AMD tries to present their best face forward, and realistically, it never really ends up like that. But it is a good way to put that price pressure on Nvidia. So there's that running joke that people want cheaper AMD GPUs, so that way they can buy a cheaper Nvidia GPU. And partially it's true. Nvidia has a massive market share, not to mention they're like dominating in AI. They made like $10 billion in the last quarter. So they're a gigantic company. AMD is also an impressive company. Just because they're smaller, especially in this gaming space, doesn't take anything away from them. But interesting to see if this $499 and the $449 7700 XT, that one is also important because if it performs better than that 4060 Ti as well, which it will do in many cases, we're definitely getting, better VRAM numbers out of these GPUs, 16 and 12 respectively, that I feel should be the minimum nowadays. Even the 4060 Ti should have been like a 12 gigabyte of VRAM GPU, even if I understand they have to change the the memory, sort of the way it's set up, because it can only be 8 or 16, but then make it a little bit different. it's not going to cost them the huge amount, but it's much worse when it's an 8 GB GPU. And if you try to play that at 1440p or even 1080p in some games that are really maxed out, you get very close to hitting that limit. And at 1440p, you basically go right past that limit. So this is like good news for that mid, range or so. There's not that much that was interesting around the $500 mark. The 4060 Ti, 16 GB, honestly, I don't really think many people bought it. And even though I don't think it's a terrible GPU, it should have been $399, and they shouldn't have even been an 8 GB version. Now, the 4060, at $299, that's actually not that bad. I actually have one here that I've been testing. I paid $289 on this guy on Amazon, which, it's not a bad experience. On 1440p, you turn on DLSS 3 in some games. It's actually a very playable experience. I was testing it against the 7600, the new 7600, which is a very cute little GPU, by the way, the reference edition. So this was, a little cheaper than the 4060, and it does perform pretty well. But in some games, it didn't do so well. Like Ratchet and Clank, that's a game I've been playing recently. The 4060 really does significantly better than the 7600, which struggles at like 20, 30 FPS on 1440p, while the 4060 gets closer to 60, especially with DLSS 3 and things like that. So definitely an interesting little dynamic going on here, but I like the pricing. I mean, it doesn't look terrible. Of course, we always wish it could be cheaper, right? But a 7800 XT, $499, how much cheaper could AMD really make it without really affecting their stack in a way? Unless they called it, I could see them calling it a 7700 XT, changing the name around, and maybe dropping the real 7700 XT to like $399 or something like that. But with GPU pricing the way it is now, this isn't so bad, is what I'm trying to say. That we've seen worse. Like the Nvidia GPUs have been always considerably more expensive. So we're going to see how the actual reviews pan out. I mean, from AMD's numbers, the rasterization looks pretty good. And maybe these, these little, not gimmicks, but these little extras that AMD is going to have, like FSR3, that Hyper RX, while maybe not perfect, like DLSS isn't perfect, maybe it might help gamers just get a smoother gaming experience with the hardware that they have, especially if they're using a 1440p monitor, which is, I don't want to say it's the standard for like a PC gamer, but you can bet a lot of like serious PC gamers have 1440p. So we're going to see how the reviews pan out, and we'll get a better analysis on the situation. All right, guys, so remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.